Stop listening to the headlines that told you this was a surprise. The collapse of Russia's initial blitzkrieg wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable mathematical result of a superpower believing its own propaganda. You were sold the image of an unstoppable Red Army, a juggernaut that would crush resistance in 72 hours. The entire world prepared for the fall of Kiev. Western intelligence agencies were counting the hours. The Kremlin was packing dress uniforms for the victory parade. But look at the reality. Look at the burning columns of armor and the generals dying on the front lines. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a catastrophic failure of geopolitical architecture. The Russian war machine didn't break because the enemy was too strong. It broke because it was designed for a war that didn't exist. You are looking at the greatest miscalculation in modern military history. And to understand it, we have to strip away the politics and look at the cold, hard mechanics of power. You're watching Power Explained, dissecting the architecture of dominance. If you value this depth of analysis, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next investigation. To understand why the Second Army in the world found itself bogged down in the mud of Eastern Europe, we must first dismantle the myth of the Russian Battalion Tactical Group. On paper, the Russian military modernization program, initiated after their clumsy performance in Georgia in 2008, was supposed to have created a lean, professional fighting force. They moved away from the mass mobilization model of the Soviet Union and toward these smaller, high-readiness units known as BTGs. These were designed to bring overwhelming firepower, artillery, armor, and air defense into a compact, mobile package. It looked terrifying in war games. It looked formidable in Syria, where they operated with total air superiority against insurgents. But a high-intensity war against a near-peer adversary is not an insurgency. It is a test of industrial capacity and logistical endurance, and this is where the facade began to crack before the first tank even crossed the border. The invasion plan itself was the first fatal constraint. It was not designed by military strategists looking at a tactical map. It was designed by intelligence officers looking at a political one. The Kremlin operated under a singular, blinding assumption that Ukraine was a failed state waiting to be kicked over. This assumption dictated the logistics. If you believe you will be welcomed as liberators, or at least that the local government will capitulate instantly, you do not prepare supply lines for a protracted siege. You do not establish secure rear areas. You drive straight for the capital in long, unprotected columns, expecting the enemy to stand down. This is why we saw Russian National Guard units, riot police essentially, driving in the vanguard alongside tanks. They brought shields and batons to a gunfight, expecting crowd control, not anti-armor ambushes. This political arrogance bled directly into the operational failure at Hostomel Airport. This was the linchpin of the decapitation strike. The plan was textbook Soviet doctrine. Seize the airfield on the outskirts of the capital using elite airborne troops, the VDV, and use it as an air bridge to fly in heavy armor and thousands of reinforcements within hours. It was a gamble on speed and shock. But when the VDV landed, they found themselves isolated. The Ukrainian response was not the disorganized panic the Kremlin anticipated. It was a coordinated artillery and counteroffensive grid. The runway was cratered. The air bridge was denied. Suddenly, the elite vanguard of the Russian military was trapped, unsupported, and being systematically dismantled. This moment was the turning point of the entire initial phase. Without Hostomel, there was no air bridge. Without the air bridge, the heavy armor had to drive from the border. And that drive exposed the single greatest weakness of the Russian military: its addiction to railways. Russian logistics are structurally distinct from Western models. NATO forces rely heavily on palletized cargo, forklifts, and a massive fleet of tactical trucks to push supplies from major hubs to the front line. Russia does not. The Russian army is tied to the railhead. They rely on manual labor, conscripts physically moving boxes of ammunition, and they lack the tactical trucking capacity to sustain operations more than 90 miles from a train station. When the invasion force pushed toward Kiev, they extended beyond their logistical tether. They were driving into hostile territory, far from the railheads in Belarus and Russia, relying on a truck fleet that had been decimated by corruption. This brings us to the tyranny of the tire. It sounds trivial, But in the world of geopolitical dominance, small mechanical failures topple empires. As the 40-mile-long convoy stalled north of Kiev, observers noticed something peculiar. The tires on strictly military vehicles were shredding. These vehicles had been sitting in storage for years, exercised only for parades. The rubber had rotted from sun exposure and lack of movement. When they were finally loaded with combat loads and driven extensively, the sidewalls burst. A blown tire on a single fuel truck on a narrow, single-lane road in the mud season doesn't just stop that truck. It stops the 10 tanks behind it. It freezes the entire column. And a frozen column is not an army. It is a target. The geography of Ukraine in late February exacerbated this mechanical failure. The phenomenon of Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, or the mud thaw, is a legendary constraint in Eastern European warfare. It stopped Napoleon. It stopped Hitler. And in 2022, it stopped Putin. The ground was not frozen solid enough to support heavy armor off-road, forcing Russian columns to stick to paved highways. This funneled their immense firepower into predictable, narrow corridors. The Ukrainians didn't need to match the Russians tank for tank. They just needed to watch the roads. By confining themselves to the asphalt, the Russians surrendered their maneuverability. They became linear targets in a three-dimensional war. Furthermore, the command structure itself proved to be a cage. The Russian military operates on a rigid, top-down hierarchy. Initiative among junior officers and NCOs is not just discouraged. It is often punished. In Western armies, if a lieutenant sees an opportunity or a threat, they are trained to act on the commander's intent without waiting for direct orders. In the Russian system, a unit waits for orders from the top. When the initial plan failed, when the 3-day war turned into a week, then a month, the junior officers on the ground were paralyzed. They had no instructions for this reality. They sat in their vehicles, radioing up the chain of command, waiting for generals to tell them what to do. This paralysis forced high-ranking generals to move to the front lines to personally untangle the traffic jams and force their troops forward. This is a violation of modern command safety principles. Generals are supposed to be in secure command posts, orchestrating the symphony of war, not directing traffic at a muddy intersection. But because the system was broken, they had to expose themselves. This allowed Ukrainian snipers and drone operators to decapitate the Russian leadership systematically. The loss of so many generals in the opening weeks was not just a morale blow. It severed the brain from the body of the army. Units were left blind, deaf, and leaderless, sitting ducks for the agile, decentralized Ukrainian defense groups that were swarming their flanks with anti-tank missiles. We must also address the failure of the Russian Air Force, the VKS. On paper, the disparity was overwhelming. Russia had hundreds of modern fighters and bombers. Ukraine had a handful of aging Soviet-era jets. Yet, Russia failed to establish air superiority. This is the dog that didn't bark of the conflict. Why? Because flying complex sorties over hostile territory requires immense coordination, pilot hours, and precision-guided munitions. It appears the VKS lacked all three. Their pilots had limited flight hours compared to their NATO counterparts. Their stockpiles of precision weapons were smaller than advertised, forcing them to fly low to drop dumb gravity bombs, bringing them into the lethal envelope of man-portable air defense systems like Stingers and Aglos. The fear of losing expensive aircraft paralyzed the Air Force, leaving the ground troops without the cover they desperately needed. The narrative of the unstoppable bear was dismantled not by a single superweapon, but by the accumulation of 1,000 systemic fractures. The corruption that siphoned fuel money into yacht accounts. The culture of lying that meant reports going up the chain of command were always green, even when the reality was red. The rigid adherence to a political fantasy over military reality. The Russian army entered Ukraine as a parade force, expecting flowers. They were met with fire, and they had no mechanism to adapt. They were constrained by their own history, their own geography, and their own hubris. But as the initial shock wore off and the war transitioned from a failed blitzkrieg to a grinding war of attrition, the nature of the conflict shifted again. The constraints that saved Kiev would not necessarily save the Donbass. The Russian machine, however clumsy, is massive, and it began to learn. To understand how they pivoted from this disaster to the grinding artillery war that followed, we have to look at the next phase of the strategy: the consolidation of ruin. You have been told that Russia failed because it was weak, but the reality is far more terrifying. They failed initially because they tried to be surgical, a style of warfare they were never designed to master. When they stopped trying to be surgical, they became a grinder. The retreat from the north was not an admission of total defeat. It was a ruthless concentration of force. The narrative that Russia was a spent force in the spring of 2022 is a comfortable lie we tell ourselves to minimize the threat. The truth is that the Russian military machine did not stop. It simply reverted to its factory settings: overwhelming mass, indiscriminate fire, and the systematic erasure of grid squares. This pivot marked the beginning of the battle for the Donbass, a conflict that bore almost no resemblance to the lightning raids on the outskirts of Kiev. In the north, Russian columns were strung out, vulnerable, and lost in the woods. In the east, they were compressed, overlapping, and inextricably linked to their lifeblood, the railway. To understand why the war changed so drastically, you must understand that the Russian army is, fundamentally, a railroad army. They do not project power through agile trucking logistics like the United States. They project power where the tracks end. By refocusing on the Donbass, they shorten their supply lines from hundreds of precarious kilometers to mere dozens, directly connected to the vast, untouchable rail network of the Russian interior. The result was the fire roller. This was not a strategy of maneuver or brilliance. It was a strategy of physics. Russian commanders, realizing their infantry was brittle and their tanks vulnerable to javelins, stopped sending men forward to take ground. Instead, they sent artillery shells. The doctrine shifted to a simple, brutal algorithm: identify a Ukrainian position, saturate it with thousands of shells until the topography itself is altered, and only then advance into the ruins to see if anyone is left alive. During the height of the battles for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Russian forces were firing upwards of 60,000 shells a day. Ukrainian defenders, often limited to a tenth of that volume, found themselves fighting not against soldiers, but against a wall of steel that moved forward 100 meters at a time. This approach negated the superior tactical flexibility of the Ukrainian infantry. It didn't matter if a Ukrainian squad was better trained or had higher morale if the building they were sheltering in ceased to exist. The Russian strategy became one of denial, denying the enemy cover, denying them sleep, denying them the very ground to stand on. It was a return to the Soviet playbook of World War II, where the primary operational variable was not the value of human life, but the weight of ordnance delivered per square kilometer. Yet, this method revealed a darker aspect of the Russian command philosophy: the weaponization of their own personnel. To locate Ukrainian firing positions, Russian commanders began using what analysts call reconnaissance by death. Freshly mobilized conscripts, mercenaries from the Wagner Group, and militias from the occupied territories were sent forward in human waves, often with little support. Their objective was not necessarily to capture the trench line, but to force the Ukrainians to open fire. Once the Ukrainian machine guns and mortars revealed their locations, the expendable assault wave would die, and the Russian heavy artillery, waiting safely in the rear, would obliterate the exposed defenders. It was a cynical, mathematically driven exchange rate, trading the lives of untrained men for the destruction of hardened fortifications. If you are looking to understand the cold calculus behind these decisions, subscribing to this channel ensures you stay informed on the deeper mechanics of geopolitical power beyond the headlines. This grinding phase exposed the limitations of Western aid at that specific moment. While anti-tank missiles had saved Kiev, they were largely useless against a battery of howitzers firing from 20 kilometers away. The war had transitioned from close-quarters ambushes to a duel of long-range ballistics, a contest where Russia held a distinct advantage in both tube count and ammunition stockpiles. The Ukrainian military was forced into a desperate gamble, trading space for time. They would hold a city like Severodonetsk until the last possible moment, inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers, and then withdraw to the next ridge, the next river, the next line of defense. It was a grueling, demoralizing retreat by inches, designed to bleed the Russian offensive dry before it could break into the open country beyond the Donbass urban agglomerations. However, the consolidation of ruin had a strategic flaw. It was incredibly slow. The fire roller could level a city, but it could not encircle an army quickly enough to destroy it. The Russian advance was glacial, capturing a few kilometers a week at the cost of unimaginable resources. This slowness gave Ukraine the one thing it needed most: time to integrate new weapon systems. While the Russian artillery was turning the east into a moonscape, the logistical hubs in Poland were processing the arrival of NATO-standard heavy weaponry. The asymmetry of the war was about to shift again. Russia was burning through its Soviet inheritance, millions of shells and thousands of armored vehicle hulls, at a rate that no industrial base could sustain indefinitely. They were winning the battles for specific towns, but they were eroding their capacity to fight the long war. The capture of Lysychansk in midsummer was hailed by Moscow as a major victory, the liberation of the Luhansk region. But in reality, it was the high water mark of their artillery dominance. The barrels of their guns were warping from overuse. Their ammunition depots were stacked high and unguarded, sitting ducks for a new kind of threat that was quietly moving toward the front lines. The Russian generals, fixated on the map and the steady, creeping red lines of their advance, failed to see that the battlefield geometry was changing. They had concentrated so much mass in the east that they had left the other sectors of the front dangerously thin. This tunnel vision is characteristic of a top-down command structure. In the Russian system, success is reported upwards, and problems are hidden downwards. A commander who captures a village gets a medal. A commander who reports that his unit is combat ineffective gets replaced. This culture of dishonest reporting meant that the Kremlin likely believed their offensive potential was still high, even as their units were reaching a breaking point. They were conquering geography, but they were losing the army. The fire roller destroys everything in its path, but it also anchors the attacker to a rigid, predictable logistics tail. The massive ammunition dumps required to feed the guns became static targets, visible from space, and vulnerable to precision strikes. By focusing entirely on the Donbass grind, Russia allowed Ukraine to dictate the terms of engagement elsewhere. The static nature of the Russian strategy meant that once the artillery stopped firing, the infantry had no maneuver capability left. They were sitting in the ruins they had created, exhausted, with supply lines that were about to be severed. The illusion of inevitable Russian victory, rebuilt carefully over months of grinding advances, was fragile. It relied on the assumption that Ukraine had no way to strike the rear. That assumption was about to be violently dismantled. The war of attrition, which Russia believed it was winning by weight of metal, was actually a trap. They had extended their reach to its absolute limit, just as the tools to cut that reach arrived on the battlefield. The stage was set not for a continued slow march west, but for a sudden, catastrophic collapse of the Russian positions in the north and south. The momentum was about to reverse, driven by a new variable that the Russian General Staff had arrogantly dismissed: the integration of precision intelligence with precision fires. This wasn't just a tactical upgrade. It was a fundamental rewriting of the rules of engagement that Moscow had relied upon for 70 years. You have to understand the sheer scale of the arrogance here. The Russian doctrine was built on the assumption that volume conquers all, that if you fire 20,000 shells a day, precision is a luxury you don't need. They were dead wrong. The arrival of GPS-guided munitions didn't just chip away at their advantage. It decapitated it. Almost overnight, the Russian rear, which had been considered a sanctuary safe from the violence of the front, turned into a kill zone. The impact was immediate and devastatingly kinetic. In the summer of 2022, the world watched a systematic dismantling of the Russian logistical spine. We aren't talking about random strikes on trenches. We are talking about the surgical deletion of ammunition depots, command centers, and fuel hubs located 40, 50, 80 kilometers behind the lines. The Russian army is an artillery army. It cannot function without massive stockpiles of shells near the railheads. When those stockpiles began to detonate in spectacular fashion, the Russian offensive capability didn't just pause, it suffered a cardiac arrest. The volume of fire, the one singular advantage they held, dropped precipitously because the shells could no longer reach the guns. This created a paralysis in the Russian command structure that is difficult to overstate. Their centralized, top-down hierarchy meant that local commanders had no authority to disperse supplies without orders from above, and the generals above were too paralyzed by the sudden vulnerability to adapt. They froze. And while they froze, Ukraine moved. This set the stage for the Kharkiv counteroffensive, a masterclass in exploiting an adversary's rigidity. Russian intelligence had become myopically focused on the south, convinced that the main blow would fall on Kherson. They moved their elite airborne units, the VDV, to the southern bank of the Dnipro, leaving the northern front in the Kharkiv region thinly manned by Rosgvardia National Guard units and hollowed-out tank regiments. It was a fatal misallocation of power. When the Ukrainian forces punched through near Balaklia, they didn't just break the line. They shattered the psychological cohesion of the entire sector. This is where the difference in doctrine became undeniable. The Russian forces, cut off from their command and blinded by electronic warfare, panicked. There was no organized withdrawal, no fighting retreat. It was a rout. We saw the Second Army of the World abandon millions of dollars of serviceable equipment, T-80 tanks, self-propelled howitzers, advanced radar systems, fleeing on stolen bicycles and civilian cars. The speed of the collapse in Kharkiv was a direct result of the Russian inability to process information and react in real time. Their decision-making loop was weeks long. The Ukrainian loop was measured in minutes. In a matter of days, Russia lost more territory than they had captured in months of grinding, bloody attrition. The myth of Russian inevitability was dissolved not by overwhelming numbers, but by overwhelming velocity. If you find this analysis of military doctrine and geopolitical maneuvering valuable, your support helps us continue these deep-dive investigations. While the North collapsed in chaos, the South in Kherson was witnessing a different, slower, but equally catastrophic failure of Russian power projection. Here, the constraint was geography. The Russian forces occupied the only regional capital they had taken, Kherson City, but they were situated on the wrong side of the Dnipro River. They were geographically isolated, dependent on a few bridges to feed a force of 30,000 men. The strategy here was not a lightning strike, but a siege of logistics. Precision fires began to walk across the Antonivsky Bridge and the dam at Nova Kakhovka. They didn't drop the bridges immediately. They rendered them unusable for heavy armor and supply trucks. The Russian army was forced to rely on pontoon ferries, which were promptly targeted as soon as they hit the water. It was a mathematical inevitability. A modern army consumes supplies at a rate that cannot be sustained by ferries under fire. The Russian commanders knew this. They requested permission to withdraw to save their equipment and manpower. But here, the political dimension overrode military necessity. The Kremlin refused the retreat for weeks, demanding the troops hold ground that was strategically untenable because losing the capital was politically unacceptable. This tension between the reality of the battlefield and the delusions of the political leadership bled the Russian army dry. When the order finally came to retreat in November, it was a humiliation. Russia had formally annexed this territory weeks prior, declaring it Russia forever. Forever lasted less than 6 weeks. The dual defeats in Kharkiv and Kherson forced a reckoning within the Kremlin. The special military operation, a term designed to suggest a limited, professional engagement that wouldn't touch the lives of ordinary Russians, was dead. The illusion that this war could be fought solely by contract soldiers and volunteers evaporated. Putin was forced to do the one thing he had desperately tried to avoid: declare mobilization. This was a critical inflection point in the power dynamics of the state. Mobilization broke the unwritten social contract of modern Russia. The people stay out of politics, and the state leaves the people alone. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of men were being pulled from the workforce, from their families, and thrown into a logistical system that was already collapsing. The videos that emerged were damning: rusty rifles, moldy rations, soldiers buying their own body armor and medical kits. It exposed the deep, systemic rot of corruption that had hollowed out the military institutions. On paper, Russia had millions of reservists. In reality, they had a disorganized mob with no training, no leadership, and no motivation. These mobilized troops were not sent to win the war. They were sent to stop the bleeding. They were meat, aimed at plugging the gaps in the line with sheer mass to slow down the Western-equipped Ukrainian maneuver units. It shifted the war from a contest of maneuver back to a contest of attrition. The Russian strategy devolved into a crude calculus. We have more bodies than they have bullets. As winter set in at the end of 2022, the Kremlin played its final strategic card, shifting the focus from the battlefield to the geopolitical energy map. They launched a massive aerospace campaign against Ukraine's energy grid, attempting to freeze the population into submission. Simultaneously, they throttled gas supplies to Europe, betting that Western unity would fracture under the pressure of cold homes and high prices. This was weaponized interdependence at its peak. Russia believed that its status as an energy superpower gave it leverage over NATO's decision-making. They expected protests in Berlin and Paris. They expected the West to force Ukraine to the negotiating table to keep the gas flowing. But once again, the Russian assessment of Western resolve was flawed. Europe pivoted with remarkable speed, securing alternative LNG supplies and absorbing the economic hit. The winter was mild. The blackouts in Ukraine, while painful, did not break the will of the population. If anything, they hardened it. The terror bombing campaign cost Russia billions in precision missiles, depleting their strategic reserves for a tactical gain that was negligible. They fired 80% of their modern missile stock to turn the lights off for a few hours at a time. It was an expenditure of strategic capital with zero return on investment. By the spring of 2023, the war had mutated. The initial Russian professional army was largely gone, replaced by a mix of mobilized civilians and convicts recruited by the Wagner Group. The battlefield had solidified into a dense network of minefields and trenches, reminiscent of the First World War but overseen by 21st-century drone surveillance. Russia had failed to win quickly, failed to win through maneuver, and failed to win through energy blackmail. They were now locked into a long war, a scenario their economy and demographics were ill-equipped to handle in isolation. But they were adapting. The initial incompetence was being replaced by a grim, ruthless adaptation to defensive warfare. They began to dig in, creating the Surovikin Line, a massive, layered defense system in the south designed to break any future counteroffensive. They realized they could not take more ground, so they decided to make the ground they held impossible to take back. The conflict had transitioned from a war of industrial capacity, and this exposed the final, most critical constraint. The Russian military-industrial complex was not self-sufficient. For all the bluster about sovereignty, the Russian war machine ran on Western bearings, Taiwanese microchips, and French optics. As sanctions began to bite, the production of advanced weaponry slowed. They were forced to turn to pariah states for help. The sight of Iranian drones and North Korean shells appearing on the front lines was not a sign of strength. It was a glaring admission of industrial inadequacy. The Second Army of the World was now scavenging for supplies, while facing a Ukrainian force that was integrating increasingly sophisticated Western systems, Patriot batteries, Leopard tanks, Storm Shadow missiles. The technological gap was widening every day. However, technology alone does not win wars if the adversary is willing to absorb limitless casualties. Russia shifted its entire geopolitical identity to support this war, burning its bridges with the West and becoming a junior partner to China, trading its future sovereignty for immediate survival. This creates a paradox of power. Russia has occupied territory, yes, but the cost of holding that territory has been the destruction of the very instruments of power, military prestige, economic leverage, and diplomatic influence that made Russia a superpower in the first place. They traded their strategic future for a tactical land grab. And as the lines hardened, the question shifted from, can Russia win? To, how long can Russia survive the bleeding? The stage was set for the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive of 2023, a campaign that would test the limits of Western equipment against the sheer density of Russian fortifications. It would be a test of whether precision could overcome mass when that mass is dug into the earth and backed by the desperation of a regime that knows it cannot turn back. Everyone assumed the Leopard tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles would slice through Russian lines like a hot knife through butter. We were told that superior technology always dictates the victor, that the Western way of war, fast, precise, networked, had rendered the trench warfare of the 20th century obsolete. But that assumption ignored the oldest, cruelest rule of combat. Geometry dictates survival. The reality that awaited the Ukrainian brigades in the south was not a disorganized mob of conscripts, but the Surovikin Line, a masterclass in defensive engineering that turned the very geography of the steppe into a kill zone. This was the moment the narrative of inevitable technological dominance collided with the brute force of industrial-scale fortification. The expectation of a lightning breakthrough was shattered in the first 72 hours. What the West had underestimated was Russia's ability to learn, not through innovation but through trauma. Having failed at the complex choreography of the Blitzkrieg, the Russian command reverted to what it understood best: static dominance. They laid minefields of a density never before seen in modern warfare, up to 5 mines per square meter, stretching for kilometers in depth. This was not a tactical delay. It was a strategic wall. When Western armor advanced, it didn't meet enemy tanks in open battle. It met invisible explosives that immobilized the columns, leaving them stranded for the attack helicopters and artillery dialed in on those exact coordinates. This phase of the war revealed the ultimate constraint on Russian power, but also its terrifying resilience. They could not project force forward, so they projected it downward, digging into the earth to ensure that if they could not take Kiev, no one could take Crimea. The conflict transformed from a war of maneuver into a war of mathematics. It became a calculation of exchange rates. How many artillery shells, how many drones, and how many lives must be spent to advance 100 meters? In this grim calculus, the Russian tolerance for attrition became their primary strategic asset. While Western nations agonized over the cost of equipment and the political fallout of a prolonged conflict, the Kremlin operated with a callous indifference to human cost that allowed them to absorb losses that would have toppled any democratic government. The battlefield itself had fundamentally changed, evolving into a transparent cage. The proliferation of surveillance drones meant that the element of surprise, the cornerstone of military victory for thousands of years, had effectively vanished. You could not mass forces for a breakthrough without being seen, and if you could be seen, you could be hit. This transparency paradox forced both sides into a stalemate of exhaustion. The Russian military machine, bloated and inefficient, found safety in this paralysis. They didn't need to be faster or smarter. They just needed to be heavier. They utilized electronic warfare systems to blind precision-guided munitions, turning smart bombs into dumb rocks, proving that high-tech systems are only as effective as the electromagnetic spectrum allows them to be. But the war was not just being fought in the mud of the Donbass. It was being fought in the shadow ledgers of the global economy. The initial failure to secure a quick victory forced Russia to weaponize its own isolation. The sanctions regime, designed to strangle the Russian war machine, instead forced it to mutate. We saw the emergence of the Shadow Fleet, a ghostly armada of uninsured tankers moving oil outside the G7 price caps, funding the war effort through the back door of the global market. This economic adaptation mirrored their military strategy. Crude, risky, but effective enough to keep the engine running. If dissecting these layers of geopolitical strategy helps you see the board more clearly, engaging with the channel ensures we can continue mapping these power dynamics together. As the lines froze, the geopolitical timeline extended. The Kremlin realized that their path to victory no longer lay in taking territory, but in waiting out the clock. The strategy shifted to escalation management against the West itself. By consistently threatening nuclear retaliation, Russia successfully deterred the full weight of NATO aid during the critical windows of opportunity. They leveraged the West's fear of chaos against the West's desire for order. Every hesitation in Washington or Berlin to send long-range missiles or fighter jets was a victory for Moscow. A victory not won by soldiers, but by psychological operations targeting the political will of their adversaries. This brings us to the core truth of why the quick victory was impossible, and why the long defeat has been avoided. The Russian system was built for a different century. It was a hammer trying to operate in a world of scalpels. When the hammer missed, it didn't try to become a scalpel. It just became a bigger hammer. The invasion failed its initial objectives because it was built on a foundation of lies, intelligence reports written to please superiors rather than reflect reality, and a logistics system hollowed out by decades of kleptocracy. They traded their strategic future for a tactical land grab, isolating themselves from the engines of modern prosperity to secure the buffer zones of an imperial past. However, the survival of the Russian war effort proves that mass still has a quality all its own. In a war of attrition, the side that cares less about its people often has the advantage. The Russian state has successfully transitioned to a total war economy, militarizing its society and indoctrinating a new generation into the cult of permanent conflict. They have accepted that they cannot be a superpower of prosperity, so they have chosen to be a superpower of disruption. They have demonstrated that a nuclear-armed state, willing to burn its own economic future, can hold the international order hostage indefinitely. The war in Ukraine has shattered the illusion of the short, sharp war. It has reminded the world that conflict between near-peer adversaries is a grinding, industrial endeavor that consumes stockpiles and lives at a rate that defies modern planning. Russia failed to win quickly because it misunderstood the nature of power in the 21st century. They believed power was purely kinetic, tanks, planes, and missiles. They failed to account for the power of a network society, the resilience of a nation fighting for its existence, and the speed at which information warfare can turn a local invasion into a global crusade. Yet, as we look at the hardened front lines today, we must recognize the uncomfortable reality. The initial incompetence of the Russian invasion has been replaced by a grim, adaptive competence. They have not won, but they have not collapsed. They have dragged the world down into the mud with them, forcing the West to confront the limits of its own industrial capacity and political attention span. The quick war is a myth. The long war is the reality. And in this new era of great power competition, the victor will not be the one who strikes the hardest, but the one who can endure the bleeding the longest. This is the new face of geopolitical dominance, not the lightning strike, but the suffocating grip. The question is no longer why Russia couldn't win quickly. It is whether the world has the stamina to prevent them from winning slowly.